Chapter 6 of Tractate Menachos begins covering the principles of the Omer flour offering. The first Mishnah says the Omer offering was a special offering brought on the second day of the holiday of Passover that was made out of flour from the new barley crop. The new barley crop could only be eaten after this offering was brought. Rabbi Yishmael says, if this Omer offering was brought on a Shabbos, it would consist of 3 se'ahs of flour, and if it was on a weekday, it would consist of 5 se'ahs of flour. The sages disagree and say it's 3 either way. There's a similar dispute. Some say on Shabbos, this barley was reaped by one person with 1 sickle and was placed in 1 basket, while on a weekday it was done by 3 people with 3 sickles and 3 baskets. Others say it was done with 3 either way. The Gemara explains this dispute as to if 3 or 5 se'ahs are required by Shabbos, as the sages say 3 se'ah is sufficient to produce the amount of good quality flour that was necessary, while Rabbi Yishmael says it requires 5, while on Shabbos we use 3 and just sieve everything at length to prevent any additional reaping and winnowing, as opposed to just this single act of sieving, which is uniquely allowed for this offering. A similar dispute seemingly exists in principle by the Paschal offering being brought on Shabbos, where one opinion says it only should be flayed up until the breast, and others say it should be entirely flayed. Although that's explained to be different and not comparable to the Omer offering here, as there's an additional factor of concern by the Paschal offering of it being disrespectful if it's left only partially flayed. So it also suggests we compare Rabbi Yishmael's opinion to the debate regarding how many reapers are required, but that's explained to be different also. Either there's an additional factor that the more reapers are used, the more this is publicized, or it's that the number of reapers just doesn't affect the actual sacrificial service. So it tries to compare it to the principle of violating the Shabbos to declare the new moon. But again, that's not comparable, as the new moon declaration was allowed specifically to prevent future errors, or it's just not comparable as it's not an offering service. Related, if somebody brings 2 communal chatas offerings on Shabbos when only 1 was needed, he's said to be liable for only the second one. This applies even if atonement was actually effected through the second animal, and even if the first animal was found to be of low quality. There's variation on who taught this latter point. It debates what the case would be if the first animal was found to be of poor quality only after the slaughter of the second animal, which is disputed based on if we go by his action or based on his intent. This is comparable to a person who hears that a child is drowning on a Shabbos, so he goes to catch some fish with a net, and then he accidentally catches and saves the child also, so it's a similar debate if he's liable or not. It additionally brings some principles showing that you're allowed to violate the Shabbos to assist a sick person. Instead of a person is said to need a fig for his health on Shabbos, and 10 separate people each bring a fig, even if they do it one after the other, and even if the sick man has already recovered, none of them are liable for doing this. And if a sick person was said to need 2 figs on Shabbos, and you could either take 2 figs from 2 branches or 3 figs from 1 branch, you can take the 3 figs from the 1 branch to reduce the amount of reaping that's being done, similar to the concept introduced by Rabbi Yishmael. New Mishnah. The Omer offering was brought from the barley closest to Jerusalem. If that wasn't ripe, it could be from anywhere, and it gives an instance where the barley ended up coming from some very distant locations. The Gemara says this was required as it's either based on a verse or it's based on the principle that we don't pass over mitzvahs, and additionally expounds on the incident of the bringing of these offerings. It also speaks a bit on Mordechai and his immense wisdom. New Mishnah. Regarding the Omer offering, people would go to the field on the day before Passover, and they would tie the barley into bundles while they were still attached to the ground, so that way everything would be easier to reap when the day came. Then on Passover, everybody would gather around, and they'd confirm that the sun had set and that they should use this sickle and basket, and if it was a Shabbos, they'd also confirm that they should reap on Shabbos. Everybody would declare that the reaping should begin, which was done 3 times, and this was done to combat the Boethusians, which was a heretical sect that said that the Omer reaping should be done on the Saturday night after the holiday instead of when it was actually done, which was on the holiday of Passover. The Gemara quotes a point that this used to be a minor holiday, and eulogizing and fasting was impermissible on this day, and it explains the Boethusians' debate against these particular dates, and it quotes discussion and disproofs that occurred in that period. It further clarifies and sources for the specific date of this offering. It also mentions in the period between Passover and the holiday of Shavuos, we count the 49 days in between, called counting the Omer, which includes counting the day and the week. New Mishnah. Anyways, the barley was harvested and placed in baskets, and according to Rabbi Meir, it was then toasted in a fire in the temple courtyard, while the sages held that the barley was first beaten with soft reeds so that way they wouldn't be crushed, and these kernels were then placed inside of perforated copper pipes and would then be placed out in the wind, and the grain would then be milled and sifted until they had an isarein of flour, which was a measurement. The remainder could be eaten by anybody and is subject to the challah tithe, but exempt from regular tithes. Rabbi Akiva actually says it's subject to both tithes. The Gemara explains this dispute between Rabbi Meir and the sages is largely based on interpretation of the words from specific verses. Rabbi Akiva says the remainder of this Omer offering must be tithed, and this is said by one opinion to be because the fact that the grain was smoothed out inside the actual temple still doesn't exempt it from tithing. Others disagree with this. Also, if the smoothing of the grain was done by non-Jewish people, there's a dispute if it's then subject to tithing. It also mentions that mixing dough belonging to the temple treasury makes it exempt from the challah tithe. So based on all this, it asks, what if dough was mixed by a non-Jewish person? Does it need to have the challah tithe removed from it, based on the earlier mentioned disputes? This opinion winds up holding that it would still require a challah tithe, but others disagree and dispute this further. Some actually hold that produce owned by non-Jewish people must be tithed rabbinically, as there was a concern that very rich people would try to commit fraud by giving their produce temporarily to non-Jewish people to exempt themselves from tithing, so this was instituted to ensure that everybody was tithing equally. This wouldn't have applied to the challah tithe, as you could just get out of paying that by baking dough in extremely small amounts. Technically, there were also other methods of getting out of regular tithes, but those would require a public action, like taking your produce out through your roof, so people wouldn't do that out of embarrassment. New Mishnah. Anyways, this Omer flour would then be mixed with flour and frankincense. More oil would be poured on top, it would be waved, and it would then be brought to the altar. A kometz handful was removed and was then burned on the altar. The remainder was eaten by the Kohanim. After the Omer was offered, the shops of Jerusalem would immediately be filled with flour and grain from the new crop, and it's a debate if this was preferable, out of concern some grain was harvested before the Omer was offered, and it might be eaten too early. The Gemara asks, according to the opinion that there is no concern that the new crop of grain will be eaten too early, that opinion had mentioned back in Tractate Pesachim that we don't search for chametz on Passover when it's forbidden out of concern that somebody might eat it. So what's the difference here? There are suggested answers. It said that people don't typically just pick up and eat from their new crop, but they are like to do that with chametz. Then the opinion that says there is no concern of searching for chametz on Passover, that says they hold that if somebody's looking for bread to burn it, they're unlikely to eat it also. Another suggestion is that unlike actual chametz, toasted grain flour is not really eaten, although this is not an accepted view as the grain was edible in the earlier stages. New Mishnah. After the Omer offering is brought, the crop becomes permitted. People who are far away from Jerusalem who don't know when the Omer is offered can start eating of the new crop from midday, as they can assume the court didn't allow any procrastination. After the destruction of the temple, when the Omer stopped being offered, it was instituted that the new crop should not be eaten in the entirety of this day, the 16th of the month of Nisan. The Gemara says an opinion. When the temple stands, it's the offering of the Omer that allows the new crop to be eaten. When the temple doesn't stand, it's the sunrise on the 16th of Nisan that makes the crop permissible, which is based on a verse. Others disagree and say that it's the sunrise that does this even when the temple stands, and waiting until after the Omer is brought is just a mitzvah. That's disputed further. It quotes our Mishnah, which said it was instituted that the new crop is just prohibited across the whole day, which was done as if people become accustomed to eating of the new crop at sunrise, and then Mashiach comes and the temple is rebuilt the next year, people might accidentally continue to eat this new crop too early. So seemingly this implies that waiting until after the actual Omer is brought is an actual full prohibition, not just a mitzvah. So some explain that this was only a rabbinic decree, others disagree, and there are a few differing opinions on the practice as to when exactly the new crop was to be eaten from. Some were stringent and waited until the end of the 17th of the month of Nisan. New Mishnah. The Omer offering would make the new grain crop permissible outside of the temple, while the 2 loaves offering would make the produce permissible inside of the temple. Meaning, bringing mincha offerings, bikurim tithes, or otherwise before the Omer is brought would be totally invalid. And they're also not allowed to be brought before the 2 loaves offering, but if one did so anyways, they're still valid. The Gemara mentions that there was a debate on this, and it was said that the prohibitions of the mincha being brought before the new crop and before the 2 loaves are not comparable, as it's before and after the permissibility to use the new crop for the general person. One of the sages took offense at the way another sage acted after giving this answer, and that other sage wound up passing away a short while after. Additionally, the prior rule shows that a libation prior to the Omer would be permitted. If the 2 loaves were brought before the Omer, that's debated from a number of sources, and that's disputed on further along with a number of similar questions which all go unresolved. For instance, it's asked if grain kernels are found in an animal's waste. If those are planted, and then the new grain is grown from that, as to whether a mincha offering could be brought from there, and that stands unresolved, along with further points. There's some discussion on principles of animal digestion, and asks if a mincha offering could be brought with grain that fell from clouds with rain, as was seen in a particular case. There are additional unresolved particular inquiries on the Omer offering. It's particularly disputed if these principles of the Omer offering, and additionally by tithing, apply to the roots of produce. Related to principles of impurity, it said that eating produce as it's still attached to the ground would not be considered an act of actual eating. It's also said that the prohibitions of forbidden plant mixtures continue to apply even in a non-perforated pot, and there's liability rabbinically for lashes. New Mishnah: wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye are subject to the challah tithes, and they can combine with each other to form minimum amounts. They cannot be eaten before the Omer offering is brought, and their new crop cannot be harvested before Passover. If they started growing, having taken root before the Omer was brought, they'd be allowed once the Omer is eaten. If it was afterwards, they'd have to wait until the next year's Omer. The Gemara says, some say these 5 grains can be sorted into 2 groups, as spelt is a species of wheat and oats and rye are species of barley. It sources these principles. When we said these grains can combine to form minimums, some say this is to teach for the prohibition against eating them before the Omer offering, some say it's for the prohibition against eating bread on Passover, some say it's for tithes, some say it's for principles of impurity. Further sources are quoted for the remaining points, and these go further. New Mishnah: we can harvest from irrigated fields before the Omer offering, but we only stack the hay afterwards. The people of Jericho didn't follow this last part, but as it wasn't a biblical violation, they weren't reprimanded. It's permitted to harvest unripe grain before the Omer to feed an animal. Some say this is before it's a third grown, some say this is even afterwards. We can harvest new grain before the Omer to help surrounding saplings, to clear out an area for a place of mourning, or to make space for an outdoor study hall. By all of these, the hay bales must be unbound. The Omer must be brought from the standing crop, but if there is none, it can be brought from previously cut sheaves. It must be from moist grain, but if there is none, dry grain can be used. It also must be for the night of the 16th of Nisan, but if it was done by day, then it's still valid. Also, the Omer overrides the Shabbos. The Gemara quotes sources for these principles and of these opinions, particularly by the Jericho dispute. Regarding the dispute as to what constitutes unripe grain, it tries to bring proofs regarding discussion on field charity laws. It sources further these concepts. We said the stalks of these cleared out areas should not be bundled, and that was to reduce the amount that you'd be being busy with them. It sources more of these principles, quoting verses. We said the Omer is valid if it's harvested on the day of the 16th. Others disagree with this and say that's prohibited, which it discusses. Anyways, some seemingly dispute the concept that the Omer offering overrides the Shabbos, which it discusses going through some various verses. It also brought up the 2 loaves offering, and some explain the consecration there occurs during the actual baking, which it then proves. And that's the end of chapter 6.